Good afternoon. Welcome to the Maison Française. I am very happy to launch today a new series of dialogues around French art and culture in the major museums of the Washington, D.C. area. Each month, we will propose a dialogue with a curator from a major institution to discover the rich collections of his or her museum, focusing on some specific works of art. This discussion series will be moderated by Vanessa Badre, whom I am very happy to introduce. Vanessa is currently an American University faculty fellow. She is a lawyer, art historian, and keynote speaker, specializing in observing and analyzing works of art to explore broader social and economic themes and concepts. You can discover her activity, including lectures and seminars, on her website, www.vanessababre.com. Our first guest is Wilfried Zeisler, Chief Curator at the Hillwood Museum, whom I thank for accepting the invitation. I am very happy to give you the floor, Vanessa, for this fascinating dialogue.
Hello, everybody. It's a great pleasure and a great honor to welcome and to introduce Wilfried Zeisler for this first museum series. Well, Dr. Wilfried Zeisler has impressive credential. He is the Hillwood Estate Museum and Gardens Chief Curator, so he is somebody very important. That's why we are very proud to have him tonight. He is a graduate of Sorbonne University and the École du Louvre in Paris. So the École du Louvre is really a dream. It's a place wonderful and marvelous to study right at the core of the Louvre Museum. So it's a wonderful experience. Wilfried has written extensively, of course, on French and Russian decorative arts, including a book on French ceramics commemorating the French-Russian alliance. Of course, he has contributed and had written many articles and contributions to books. The title of his dissertation is The French Objets d'Art and Luxury Goods in Russia. It was written in French. And the word objet d'art is not translated in English, so we keep it. And his dissertation was published in Paris in 2014. So since 2009, Dr. Wilfried Zeisler has participated in and curated exhibitions in Paris, Monaco, and of course, Washington, D.C. At Hillwood, maybe many people have seen his most recent exhibitions, whose titles are as follow: Fabergé Rediscovered in 2018, Bouc de Vries, and the topic was War and Pieces in 2019, and in 2020, Natural Beauties, Exquisite Works of Minerals and Gems. So everything made by Dr. Wilfried Zeisler. He had also co-authored a book whose title is Konstantin Makovsky, the Tsar's Painter in America and Paris in 2015. And he is also the author of Fabergé Rediscovered and Vivre la Belle Époque à Paris, Paul de Russie et Olga Palais, both published in 2018. And of course, as every curator, he has a lot of books where he's working on many books. And now he's currently working on 2 book projects, one exploring the connections between the Yusupov and Parisian culture, and the second on the collection of Hillwood founder, Mrs. Marjorie Post. So it's really a great honor, a great pleasure to have you with us for this first series. And I would like to begin by asking you a first question. Of course, in Washington, D.C., everybody has heard about Hillwood. But could you tell us a few words about the specificity and the originality of Hillwood Museum, please?
Thank you very much, Vanessa. Thank you for having me tonight. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce you all to our institutions, the Hillwood Estate Museum and Gardens here in Washington, D.C. It's actually an estate of about 25 acres in the northwest area of Washington. It was the former house of Marjorie Post, our founder. And here you can see the Georgian style, of the mansion, which is where we store and present our main collection. And here is actually a portrait of our founder, which was done in the 1930s by this successful English artist, Frank Salisbury. And it was done in the 1930s. And Marjorie Post was the only child of C.W. Post, the founder of Postum Cereal, which later was known as General Foods. And so as the only child of this entrepreneur, she would inherit the family business in 1914 and take over and develop it. And so she's mostly known as a business person, a philanthropist, and of course, a collector. And she lived in different, cities where we are located in Washington, D.C. So we are on the hill in the center of Rocky Park. And what is circled, maybe it's hard to see, it's actually the Washington Monument. So we are in the district in the city. And as I said, so it's a mansion where you can enjoy the collection. It's a garden. And the garden is divided, I will say, in two different parts. You have the more formal part of the garden. You can see it here on the left, the French parterre, inspired by French tradition of gardens. And on the right, a large part of the garden is also more woodland. And you can see here one of our trail that you can enjoy when you visit us. And in addition to the gardens, the mansion where the permanent collection is, we also have special exhibitions. And inside the mansion, of course, you have over 20,000 works of art. They are not all on view. We have about 25% of our works of art on view, mostly Russian art, but also French art. And I will give you a minute more details about that. But just wanted to give you a background about the Russian art aspect of our collection. So we are considered one of the largest collection of Imperial Russian art outside of Russia. We have about 500, I mean, we have more than that, but 500 objects from the Russian art collection are presented in this icon room. You can see here on this slide. The icon room is actually the Chamber of Treasures or Cabinet de Curiosité or Schatzkammer built by Marjorie Post, where she gathered all of her Russian works of art. And she fell in love with Russian culture, as I used to say, when she actually in the 1930s was able to travel to Soviet Russia with her husband, Joe Davis, who was just appointed ambassador of the United States to Moscow. And she lived actually about 1.5 years in Russia, in Moscow. And at that time, the Soviet regime was still selling off part of the imperial heritage. And so she was able to buy from state-run antique shops treasures, and that became the beginning of her passion for this Russian culture that she was going to mix with her French culture. She began to collect with. And here you can see just an example, and that's why we are famous for. So part of our Russian collection include actually 2 imperial Fabergé Easter eggs. Fabergé sounds very French, but he's very Russian. The name is from French origin, but he left France, a family left France in the 17th century and settled later in Germany, and then finally in Russia in the mid-19th century. And it's during the late 19th century that Fabergé became famous by creating these amazing imperial Easter eggs. And here are the 2 we own on this slide, shown closed and open. They are unfortunately empty, but the surprise didn't come with the eggs when Marjorie Post acquired them. And they are part of the iconic pieces we own. And just to give you a sense, there are only 50 or 52, depending on how many we count them, and we have 2 in our collection. So that I think gives an overview of what you can expect to experience when you come to visit us, Russian art, but also a lot of French art.
Thank you, Wilfried, for this very interesting introduction. I feel that we are very privileged to have this tour with the curator-in-chief. We are very, very fortunate. So now, what would be the most emblematic masterpiece of the museum? We have toured the gardens. We saw, of course, this absolutely exquisite and beautiful eggs by Fabergé. But what is the most emblematic masterpiece in the museum?
Well, I mean, there are several, but since I wanted to focus on the French culture and French art, I chose a French piece. And I know Marjorie Post is mostly known for her as a collector of decorative arts, but I chose to start with a painting because I think it says a lot about her taste and actually the success of French art and French culture abroad. And this is actually a wonderful royal painting made by Jean-Marc Natier, who was one of the most successful and prominent, very famous portraitists during the reign of Louis XV. And this is a portrait of the Duchess of Parma and her daughter Isabel. And the Duchess of Parma was actually the daughter of King Louis XV of France. And this is one of several portraits that Natier did of members of the French royal family and of the Duchess of Parma as well. And as Natier was so famous and so successful, it was actually traditional at that time for portraiture. He would actually reproduce, successful compositions such as this one in a garden, very fashionable, very naturalistic, typical of the mid-18th century, and actually use faces he would have painted prior to that, and he will keep as a model and repeat them on different, versions or different paintings in different compositions. And for royals or clients, it was absolutely wonderful because they will have the same face on each portrait at different time of their life, so they will never actually age. On this portrait, you have also, they look wonderful. They are very typical, and you can see the daughter of Louis XV, so holding the lily flower, which is a symbol of the French royal family. So really a symbol of their status and position at court. And this is a portrait which was documented from the mid-18th century and typical of this symbol of, the old regime of France that, collectors such as Marjorie Post will love to acquire. And she actually bought that piece in the 1920s when she was then living in New York. And actually when she moved to New York in the late 1910s, it was a time when many collectors in the US were building this amazing art collection, and everything had to be 18th century French, was very fashionable at that time. I can just think about, the Frick collection, which is really famous, of course, of that same period. And of course, she worked with the same dealer and tastemaker of the time, such as Duveen and other art dealers. And Duveen will actually, he was a renowned art dealer, and he will, advise her, and she will buy art from him. And so not only paintings with royal connections as this one, but also pieces of furniture and decorative objects from France. And this painting I chose because it's actually representative of that taste, but also of how progressively Marjorie Post built her taste for French 18th century art and culture. And just to give you a sense, I wanted to show you, and that's thanks to the richness of our archives, to show you how these pieces look like in her former houses, because Hillwood, as I said, was acquired in 1955, but Marjorie Post had different homes prior to that, and she will move her collection from a home to another. So today, actually, we can almost recreate the history of her different homes through our collection, which is a sort of summary of her different tastes. Here you can see in the main room in this New York apartment she had built in the 1920s, which was a huge triplex apartment of 54 rooms. And this was one of the main reception rooms, the French drawing room, French room, of course, in the French 18th century style, with the portrait I just mentioned she acquired. And as a pendant to create a pair, you have the portrait of the Duchess of Parma and her daughter Isabel, and then the other side, Marjorie Post and her youngest daughter. So the daughter to the king and the daughter to, C.W. Post here with her own daughter. So it's sort of parallel about her, taste and how she used French culture and French 18th century art as a model. And I circled on the same photo objects she acquired at the same period from Duveen, for example, such as this table, which is an 18th century French table showing the know-how of French cabinet makers of the 18th century, which she acquired as a piece that might have belonged to Queen Marie Antoinette, because of course Queen Marie Antoinette and her lifestyle and her story was a model that, of course, foreign collectors and also French collectors love to, follow up as a sort of source of inspiration and like to find objects which had connection with the Queen of France. And as you can see, which was put on that table in the 20s in the New York apartment of Marjorie Post, shown here on this slide with this small photo, it's actually Marjorie Post wearing a ball costume inspired by an historic costume of Marie Antoinette. So she was masquerades were very popular in the 1920s, and Marjorie Post had several costume made, including several actually featuring Marie Antoinette. And here is one example. On the other side, in connection to this painting still, on the other side of the same room in the New York apartment, you had actually French 18th century tapestry, which are still at Hillwood today, and circled here two wonderful pieces of furniture that Marjorie Post acquired in the 20s from Duveen, again, the same dealer. And here, these are what we call jewelry cases, or which were very popular in the 18th century. There were several made. They are French. They are by Martin Carlin, a famous cabinet maker, and who was known to use actually plaques of Sèvres porcelain, the famous French manufactory, inlaid here, so to create and bring this colorful aspect to these pieces of furniture. And the first example was known, had been delivered for Queen Marie Antoinette, and several had been made. And so Marjorie Post had two, and I will say, unfortunately, she gave them to her daughter, who was also a Francophile and who lived in Paris. And that's why nowadays these two pieces of furniture, you can see them, one at Versailles and one at the Louvre. Both were given by Marjorie Post's daughter to actually to France in the second half of the 20th century. But we still have a few objects, in our collection, and the main pieces from our French collection from the 18th century are actually today at Hillwood in the French drawing room. And here is a detail of our wonderful portrait I was showing to you, and surrounded by a selection of our 18th century French, furniture and objects, such as a table adjustment shown earlier on. But here also other example that Marjorie Post acquired in the 1950s for Hillwood. On the left, for example, this exquisite swivel chair, which has stamps stating that it once was owned by the Queen of France, Marie Antoinette, so that it belonged to her household. And on the right, the large armchair is actually a modern wood structure from the 20th century, but the tapestry was made at the Gobelin, the famous tapestry manufactory in Paris in the late 18th century, and was part of a set of Gobelins that the Queen of France, Marie Antoinette, and the King Louis XVI presented to the Prince of Prussia in the late 1780s. So a diplomatic gift and an extraordinary piece as well with royal connection. So that gives you a sense of, around that piece, that portrait of Marjorie Post's interest for 18th century French culture.
Thank you very much, Wilfried. I'm sure we will all go to Hillwood to discover or to see again this portrait by Nattier. And it's interesting to see that it's an emblematic piece of the collection. And at the same time, it is emblematic of the painting by Nattier with this beautiful dress in blue. And we know that there is a special blue by Nattier, and it's even an expression. Now, if we're talking about blue, we are going to say, oh, it's a dress that is bleu Nattier. So it's really wonderful for us to see this, to admire this painting at Hillwood. And for myself, for sure, I will go again very soon. Now, I can't resist the temptation to ask you the usual question, and of course the most difficult. What is or what would be your favorite piece in this marvelous collection?
So what I usually see to this question, because I have it, often, is that I have too many pieces that I like, and they change on a regular basis because, our collection is quite large. So it gives us often the opportunity to study some of the pieces which are in storage, or we are focusing on other pieces because of specific projects we are working on. And for today's, actually, I said, well, I think we should, my favorite will be a French piece, of course, which also represent a very important aspect of our collection. So I was, talking about Marjorie Post's interest for 18th century French culture, but she also was interested in her contemporary creations of French, culture and French art. And she is known as for having been one of the major clients of many jewelers, American and, French and others, but especially from Cartier. And here I selected for you today this frame, which is a wonderful frame from the 1930s. We have about 130 pieces by Cartier in the exhibit, in the collection. So jewelry, but also decorative object, which is quite rare. And this piece is made of, has this very simple Art Deco design, very modern, I think. So, and I think they work well with 18th century also art and design. They are made of precious material, lapis lazuli for the base, agate and gold and light blue enamel. And here it's a piece featuring a portrait of Marjorie Post, our founder. And what I like about our collection that sometimes, you can see when you look closely to some of our portraits or photographs, objects that we actually still own. And here she's actually framed in a Cartier frame, wearing a Cartier piece of jewelry. And the necklace you can see her wearing on this portrait is the one you can see on the left. And what you see on the left is actually the back of this amazing piece of jewelry. It's a pearl necklace that Marjorie Post commissioned in the 1930s from Cartier, New York. Cartier became really successful in the late 19th century. Family members opened branches in London, in New York. And once it was open in New York, Marjorie Post became a really great client of Cartier. And when she was traveling, she would also visit Cartier's boutique in Paris. And that necklace here was commissioned in New York. But what I love is the fact that all these diamonds and this large, diamond in the center, which is around 5 carat, is the clasp of the necklace. So you will see that at the back and the front are the pearls. Originally, the necklace was made of natural pearls, but she later actually distributed these necklaces, these natural pearls to her daughter. And so she had them replaced by cultured pearls in the 60s. But still, it's a wonderful piece, which gives you a nice example, of our Cartier collection. And I like how, you can connect several objects together because of the specific iconography of this small miniature portrait, which is painted on ivory. She was really into details, and she had she knew exactly how she wanted to be featured, and also how the detail of the miniature had to match the detail and the color or the pattern of the frames. So that's, I think, it's a wonderful example of our collection, and one of the pieces that I really enjoy curating and having the opportunities to study.
Great, thank you. We have another question, but you already gave us some clues. But what would be the main topic of the museum? What would be the common thread in all the works of art shown in the museum? We could all guess that there would be something about French art and Russian art, but well, what would it be?
Well, I think it's really that what speaks to this connection. So yes, when you come to visit it, you can learn about French 18th century art, Russian imperial art and culture, American lifestyle also in the 20th century. But what really connects many of our works of art is actually the objects that speaks to the success of French culture abroad. So in the US, of course, because they were collected by Marjorie Post, but also we have a lot of example of objects which were French made but for the Russian court. And let's start with one of the wonderful, very known Francophile, who is Catherine the Great. And I will say that Marjorie Post, who maybe we could say began being interested in French culture with Marie Antoinette, continued to be interested in Russian and French culture through Catherine the Great. And here we have one of the many portraits of the Empress we have in our collection, which was made, it's a very rare actually composition model, which we only know another version, a full-length portrait of this image of the Empress, which is at the Hermitage. This one is in our collection and was done by Pierre-Étienne Falconet, who is a lesser known portraitist painter from the second half of the 18th century, but he was actually the son of the famous sculptor Falconet, who was invited to come to St. Petersburg by the Empress Catherine to create the famous sculpture of Peter the Great, which is still one of the most famous monuments in St. Petersburg. And here she is featured as an empress wearing, the crown on her top of her head and having these orders of St. Andrew and the military order of St. George and the blue ribbon of the order of St. Andrew, which are like high orders from Russia that she's wearing here on her dress. So this is really a great example of this kind of very strong connection, an artist working for the Russian court and for Catherine the Great. And I have to say that, we have a lot of objects which speaks to Catherine the Great and France. And one of the piece is one only piece, but we are so proud to have it and so happy to have it from a very famous service, a set of china of porcelain that Catherine the Great commissioned in the 1770s from the famous French porcelain manufactory at Sèvres. And she was so, interested, involved in her commissions that she was really choosing the details, the motif, how it should look like, the color, and it became one, it's sometimes said one of the most expensive service ever made at Sèvres. It was a service for 60 guests, if I well remember, over 700 pieces. Most of them are still at the Hermitage today, but a few left Russia already in the 19th century. And we have one ice cup that you can admire here with this blue background, which is a typical blue de Sèvres, bleu céleste, very typical that she absolutely wanted for this service. The design is neoclassical, which was really the taste of the Empress of Russia. And especially what's interesting here is this little painting here of a profile in the antique style, which is inspired by cameos, is carved, hearthstone from the 18th century. And we know that Catherine the Great was one of the major collector of cameos and intaglio of hearthstone, of carved stone in the 18th century. And so she really wanted to have these models on a painting inspired by her taste on these porcelain pieces, and that's why it's actually called the cameo service. So Catherine the Great, through portraiture, through commission she did, we have in our collection, but also objects that shows how Catherine the Great somehow became an iconic figure that inspired French makers and tastemakers. And for example, in our collection, we have a large collection of French 18th century gold boxes. And some of them came from a very famous merchant of luxury. The merchant of luxury in 18th century France were the tastemakers of the time. They were like very connected with the best jewelers or makers of the time and knew the best clientele. And some of them became so famous that sometimes as a foreigner, when you come to Paris, you will have to visit their shop and choose, what was the latest fashion of Paris. And here, for example, from Petit Dunkerque, Le Petit Dunkerque was one of these famous shops of luxury in Paris. You have here two examples of these round gold boxes. On the right, one very innovative, especially in the design of this enamel work, which is trying to imitate leopard skin, which is quite amazing with this sort of like orange color and this black stain on the top. So which is typical of this sort of always research of new trends, new style in French decorative arts and luxury goods. And on the left, from the late 18th century, we don't know if it was a special commission or just because it was a famous, person, figure of the time. So it's actually a box, again, with a new technique, the verre églomisé. It's actually a painting underneath a piece of glass that you can see here. And it features actually the Empress Catherine the Great as Minerva, so as a goddess of wisdom and reason. And that's a very rare example and an interesting, example of a French maker, producing a box with a portrait of a foreign ruler, Catherine the Great. So something very typical of the kind of goods that you could find in France at that time, and that made French luxury goods quite famous. And this mix between, I will say, luxury, new design, new technique is really typical of, this French luxury goods, and that made them so appealing to foreign clientele. And we can find it here again with another example, which is a piece I really enjoy myself because it's a piece that I knew for a very long time, even before I was hired by Hillwood, because it was part of my research. It's a French piece commissioned by the Russian court. So it was really wonderful to be able to look at it and study it. It's a pendant watch from the 19th century, from the period of the Second Empire, from 1866. It's made of precious materials, so mother of pearl, gold, and has, it's a watch, and it's has also very significant design here, which helps you identify the history behind this watch. And that's also something I like about our collection, and that also was something important for our founder, not only to acquire, pieces, exquisite pieces made by the best makers or with the most fashionable design, but also pieces that has a very strong story to share and to tell. And here, of course, you see that, and you can see these two coat of arms. You have the coat of arms of Russia, the double-headed eagle. You have the coat of arms of Denmark. And this watch, which was made in Paris at the Palais Royal by Charpentier Houdin, which was one of the most famous watchmaker of the time, actually commemorates the union between Russia and Denmark. And actually, so the union between Alexander, the future Alexander III, and his wife here, future Empress Maria Fedorovna, born Princess Dagmar of Denmark. And we know that because of the coat of arms, but also because when you open the watch, as you can see here, there is a miniature portrait of the future Alexander III. So it's really a touching commemorative piece that we think was presented by Alexander, the Grand Duke Alexander, to his future wife at the time of their engagement. And this engagement actually has also a strong connection to France, because Alexander, future Alexander III, was engaged to Dagmar, future Empress Maria, only because his brother, the heir to the throne, died in Nice in south of France in 1865. And because of this, because he was engaged to Dagmar prior to that, so because of the death of his brother, so in Nice in France, so Alexander got engaged to Dagmar, and that's how the union happened. But so there is a strong connection due to France, and also an important part of Russian history through this event, and then through this piece, which is now in our collection. And I was talking about design and also about technology. Yes, it's a pendant watch by the best watchmaker of the time, but this photo specifically is signed by Lafont de Camarsac, who was a very successful photographer of the time, who developed actually new techniques of printing photography and printing them on enamel. And that's one actually of the first example of that new technique. So there is also this new technology which can be told when you study this piece. And the piece was so extraordinary because of the commission, because of the material, because of the design, because of the technology, that it was actually shown by Charpentier Houdin at the Exposition Universelle, or World Fair, in Paris in 1867, and was reproduced in many of the catalogs published at that time. So I think this object speaks a lot about one of the trends we have in our collection, which is this French-Russian connection.
Thank you. I'm sure everybody is dying to go and see these objects. So the museum is open. Please come. You just have to enroll on the website. But the museum is open and very, very easy to come and visit. There was a little question about the size of the ice cup. Is it a gigantic one or something very, very tiny?
Very small. It's very small. It's like almost the size of a coffee cup, a very like an espresso coffee cup.
Oh, so, to put ice, but for vodka, or what was the purpose?
No, it's ice cream. It's for dessert.
Ice cream. Oh, yes. I see. Ice cream. I understand. So small cup for
yeah,
ice.
because I mean, in the 18th century, it was hard to have, ice cubes to maintain the ice very hard. So you will most likely kind of drink it because it was not as hard as it is nowadays.
I see. Well, I'm for myself, I'm dying to go and see and to pay attention, because I saw this cup, but I must admit that I haven't paid so much attention. But now I'm sure everybody wants to go and see, and even if we can't try it, at least we will see.
No.
So usually we say, well, scholars say that a work of art, a painting, is explained by the cultural, political, economical context. But at the same time, a painting has also a lot to tell us about a culture and an epoch. We can observe a painting through the lens of social and cultural art history, but we can also consider a work of art through the lens of current event. So I'm sure that you guess what I'm going to ask you. Well, the most pregnant, important current event is the pandemic. So how the museum, how did you, as the curator-in-chief, how did you deal with the pandemic, apart from the fact that the museum has been closed for a while?
Well, yeah, I mean, we have followed the rule and we reopened reservation, as you said. But yes, we have like some stories about what happened to our collection. I mean, yes, as a curator, we don't travel anymore to give conference. So we are on Zoom right now. That's, one of the consequences, but it had also consequences on our collection. And here I'm going back to actually our French drawing room. And actually on the other side of the room, you have one side, you have the Natier I showed you earlier today. And then on the other side, you have this wonderful portrait. One is from the 18th century, speaks to the royalty of the period. And on the other side, you have a 19th century masterpiece by Franz Xaver Winterhalter, who was a German artist, but who was active in Paris and was one of the most fashionable and successful portraitists, of the 19th century. And he's mostly known for having done, many portraits of, Queen Victoria, King Louis Philippe of France, Emperor Napoleon III, and Empress Eugenie. And this portrait of Empress Eugenie is a wonderful portrait. It's an exquisite work of art, has an extraordinary provenance, came from the Empress, who presented it to one of her court member and stayed within the family of this court member until the mid-20th century, when it was acquired through Marjorie Post, interior designer, French & Co. In the 50s. And it has also its original frame, as you can see here, at the top of which you have the coat of arms of Napoleon of the Second Empire. And so and it's also typical of the taste of the period, very 18th century inspired. She's wearing this amazing dress, inspired by 18th century fashion. And as you know, also for us, it makes a perfect connection at Hillwood, because Eugenie, the Empress, is mostly known for having, developed a taste for 18th century France, for Marie Antoinette, patronizing the restoration and of Trianon at Versailles, preparing, this sponsoring exhibition around Marie Antoinette, choosing objects of art that belong to Marie Antoinette for her own interior. So it's a really wonderful piece of the story we tell at Hillwood. But to go to our current situation with the pandemic, so curators love to travel, to share with different public in different areas. So we don't travel anymore, but a way to share we also participate into different exhibitions. And Empress Eugenie, our portrait, as I like to say, she loves to travel and she loves to go back to France. And she has traveled a lot. Recently, she has been to Houston in 2016 for the Winterhalter exhibition. Then she went to Paris at Orsay for the Second Empire exhibition in 2017. And here she's featured in this wonderful gallery at the Orsay Museum. And it's lovely because she's like facing her son here. So it's just, I think, a wonderful story. And she was continuing, traveling. In 2019, she left again. In the fall of late 2019, she left again. And here she's like in her crate and she's happy. She's going to Versailles for a wonderful exhibition which opened in 2019. It was an exhibition called Versailles Revival. So it was exploring actually how in the second half of the 19th century, starting with the Empress Eugenie, Versailles had, being a sort of source of inspiration, of influence all over the world. And here she's featured, in the exhibition, and an exhibition which was supposed to close on March 15, 2020. And for those of you who, remember a year ago, as we will say, so the lockdown started actually in France a few days before the actually closing of the exhibition, and then a couple of weeks later here in the US. And so Empress Eugenie, had to stay for several months in Versailles. So I don't know how happy she was to be there, but she only came back actually over the summer, and she was back in the French drawing room in August. So that's just like a way how, this situation has also impacted, of course, exchanges, exhibitions, travels, also for works of art. And still, I mean, she's traveling again soon. She's actually going to Richmond in the fall for another exhibition project. So it's one really of our masterpieces that travels a lot, and among others who was stuck and couldn't travel anymore due to the situation.
Thank you, Wilfried. Really amazingly interesting. We are going to have a longer queue of people waiting outside of the garden gate to come inside the museum. We have a lot of questions to ask you. There are some questions about the Post family.
Mm-hmm.
Where does she come from, Mrs. Post? From which state?
So she was born in Springfield, Illinois, and then so her father developed the company in Michigan, in Battle Creek. That's where everything started. And then when she took over in the 1950s, she would move to New York, where she lived until the late 30s. And then she traveled, as I mentioned, in Europe a lot with her husband, Joe Davis. So first in Moscow and then in Brussels. And then because after Moscow, he was appointed ambassador in Brussels in Belgium. And so with the outbreak of the Second World War, they moved back to the US, and then they settled in Washington, DC.
Oh, thank you. And there is a question also about the fact, well, she obviously was completely fond of French and French culture. And some people would like to know if she spoke French.
I'm afraid not. I mean, I don't have a certain facts on that, but as far as I know, in the, archives I worked on recently, there is a lot of exchange with, French suppliers. I mean, not only jewelers, but also linen, tablecloths, fashion, and all of that. So usually the invoices and the correspondence will be in English, but sometimes they will actually write to her in French, and they start always by, "I'm so sorry to write you in French, but I don't have time and I want this to be, quickly sent to you." And it's always accompanied with a letter translated. So I assume that she would ask a translator or someone for her to translate it for her.
yes, she might have some stuff to
Yes.
do translation work. Well, I'm sure she has.
And also because she was not dealing necessarily, I mean, that's part of the answer. So I am afraid not, but also having this translation was also because she wouldn't deal with all of that. So she would have staff to deal with it, which definitely wouldn't speak French, but I don't think she spoke actually French. Yeah.
And some people are wondering as well if she had some interest apart from French art, you know, if she was interested in literatures. Do you have some books, or was she focused only on art, or did she had a French interest but for other things?
So it's mostly, I will say, art and I mean, portraiture, furniture, gold boxes, I mean, porcelain, Sèvres, especially regarding French culture. So she had a large library, and it's still part of our collection today, and it has grown, you know, decades after decades. There are some books related to French art, French culture, but mostly how she built her collection of books was to support or document her collecting and her collection. So this will be the core of her, let's say, French, you know, like part of the library. But regarding literature, there might be a few books here and there, especially memoirs or books about Queen Marie Antoinette or other royals. But again, more to support, I will say, her collecting.
And at Hillwood Museum, do you have a library for scholars, or what happened to our collection of books? Is it available for scholars?
Yes, so the library is divided into in different parts. So some of it actually is part of the display. So you can see some of the books on when you go for a tour of the mansion. And if you want to see some of them, you can of course request them. And then what we call the research library, which includes some of the books that she began to acquire. And then she hired a curator in the 1950s to work with her, who helped her develop this part of her library. And this is our research library. And we also have archives. And these are available by appointment only for now. But I have a very good news to share that we are inaugurating this year a new collection and research center with a really proper reading room, where by appointment also you will be able, hopefully starting this summer, to come and look at, you know, our archives and books and other special collections in that area of our collection. And if you want to have a look, I mean, we are on our website, you can do research on the library to find out which kind of books we have. Of course, it's mostly a lot of Russian, but we have also, it supports really all the aspects of our collection.
Great. And there are some questions about her family. You know, we would like to know if she was alone in the world of art, or did she bring her children? Did she have many children? And because in fact everything was given as a foundation, and now we have the museum. You explained to us that her house would be changed into a museum. What about the children? Did they want to have a collection or not? How was it?
This is a great question. And all this aspect I love, because this is what we are developing for our future publication. So it seems that many people will be interested in this book, which is coming out next year. Yes, she had three daughters, Adelaide, Eleanor, and Dina. Dina Merrill was a famous actress, as you may know. Some of them, they all inherited like part of, you know, some part of the art, some part of the collection, some part, of course, of the jewelry and other things. Some of them had developed, you know, real interest into art, especially Eleanor, who lived in Paris and had a wonderful collection of 18th century art. And actually, she will buy objects for her mother, and then she will also exchange works of art between both. So Eleanor, Marjorie will give her objects, and that's, for example, the two jewelry coffer that now are at Versailles. They arrived there through Eleanor. And also I wanted to mention that Marjorie Post's father was also a collector, but of a completely different aspect, where really a Gilded Age kind of like taste. And we do have also part of this collection in storage. So we have actually it represents really two generation of art, three generation of art collection in 20th century America. And I have to say also that the daughters and still the family today is very generous to us, and they continue to give us objects that actually came from Marjorie Post and which come to enrich our collection.
Oh, wonderful. We have also some questions about the places where she used to live. You talked about Illinois. She came from Illinois. You talked about the New York, the lavish New York apartment. You said that she traveled a lot in Europe, in Russia with her husband, who was the ambassador. But people would like to know if she had other properties.
Sure, she had. So let's say like New York, yes, was at the beginning her main, estate. So first a mansion on Fifth Avenue and 92 Second Street. And this mansion was destroyed to build actually a higher building, on the top of which you have this triplex apartment. And this building still exists, but it's now divided into smaller apartments, even though they are still quite big, believe me. And then she had a large camp, Camp Topridge in the Adirondack, so in upstate New York, where she will spend sometime in the fall. It's a large camp with a lot of cabins. It's really lavish, and it's more, and it's one of her was one of her favorite location. And then of course she one of her favorite homes was Mar-a-Lago, the famous estate in Florida that she built in the 1920s, and where she will spend most of her winters. And this estate was sold to the current owner in the 1980s. And then she also traveled, of course, all over the world. And she did that often with her yacht, the Sea Cloud, which she had built in the 1930s, it still exists. Actually, it's now privately managed by a cruise company. And also she had it was not a home, but she had a Merryweather, which was her plane she used also to travel.
Thank you. You talked about her, a merchant or dealer she was working for. And we have a question about any particular antique dealer for the French objet d'art that she bought. But I think you already answered by talking about this gentleman who helped her. I can't remember his name.
Duveen. Yeah, Duveen was one of the main purveyor of, not only French art, but what was available and collected at that time for the British, but also the American collectors. And he works for, prominent collectors of the period. But she was also dealing with other art dealers and interior designers, and which I could share the names right now, but they are, even she bought a lot from them. They are not very, known today, but all them will be listed in our forthcoming publication. But Duveen is the most famous one. And then she had other dealers based either in London or Paris. And for example, dealers from which she will buy objects with strong French-Russian relationship. I could mention, for example, À la Vieille Russie in New York, which originally was based in Paris, or Wardsky in London. And she would buy, Russian art there, and also French gold boxes, for example, or objects with Russian provenance there.
Thank you. I have a question about her married life. Well, Mrs. Post was married several times, asked one of a person. And but she's known as Mrs. Post. So what is the relationship between the name of her different husbands during her marriage? This is a question about family name.
So yeah, absolutely. So Marjorie Post was born Marjorie Post, and she married several times, as you said. And usually when she would marry, she would actually take her husband's name, and sometimes keep both names. So she was Marjorie Post Close, Marjorie Post Hutton, Marjorie Post Davis, and finally Marjorie Post May. I mean, but she decided to, at the end, she was single, so she will keep her, name. So yeah, but usually, so she would have to, when we have some documentation about the fact that, each piece of linen had embroidery, or you had like engraved, monograms. So for you, she would have to redo all of that on a regular basis.
Now we have a question dealing with money matters.
Okay.
In
Sure.
fact, well, it's easy to donate to the Hillwood Museum for sure.
Oh, yes.
So please do it and support. But there is a question about how the museum is financed, and what are your plans to continue to acquire art, decorative art pieces that are at the top quality, that would continue the highest preciousity that you already have in the museum?
So yes, that's a great.
A lot of money.
No, that's a great question. I mean, so I will respond. I mean, so yeah, there is like one aspect is like, yeah, how we operate, and then the acquisition fund somehow. So I will say that we have an endowment which support a large part of our operating budget, but then for all the programming, exhibitions, if you want to help us for acquisitions, all of that. So fundraising is also really key for us, and plus our own incomes which come from the visitors and from the shop and the cafe, all of that. So but yeah, we have an endowment plus fundraising and our own income. So that's for how we work. And then regarding acquisition, so we have an acquisition fund which is not necessarily very large, because it's not one of our main mission. And for those of you who have been to Hillwood, you can see how busy, I will say, how crowded the permanent collection is. And there are a lot of objects, as I said, 20,000 works of art, about 25% on view. So there are a lot in storage. And that's why also we do this special exhibition. It's a way to showcase, some of our objects from storage, but still we continue to collect. Especially objects that are either directly connected to our pieces already in our collection. So for example, an additional piece from a service, kind of things. Objects which are directly connected to our founder, because the collection, some parts went here and there, and then when they appear on the market, and which it makes sense for us to have them back, we will buy them back. And for example, we bought some in the recent years some pieces of jewelry, and we are still looking for some jewelry that she owned to enrich our collection. And the last part of our area where we develop our acquisition is the Russian collection, because this is really our strength. And I will say especially areas which are maybe less represented from that aspect, and especially actually the French-Russian connection is something that it makes us very specific and unique, and that we have done recently great acquisition on that aspect. So yeah, we do regular acquisitions, and we have a little fund to support that.
Thank you. You talked about the portrait by Winterhalter, who was unfortunately stuck in Versailles. But we have some questions about other pieces of the collection. Do they travel a lot? Do they go to France, or do they go to other museums in the world? I understand that the question is about, yes, traveling pieces. What is your politic?
Sure. So, I mean, when we have like loan requests, and I should have mentioned that about the Winterhalter, I mean, yes, it was stuck and then it had to come back. But I will say that the situation has helped us also develop some new, ways to do things that we will most likely keep afterwards, after the crisis. So that was a positive thing, because usually such a masterpiece such as this painting will travel, with someone from us, be with it all the time, checking that everything is doing fine. But, with the travel ban and all of that, it was not possible. So actually we were following live each step of our, so it was not physically with the painting, but we had a sort of camera watching it from our end here. So like, and that was something that is really was new in the sort of museum world, and is something that most likely we will keep for some of these travels. Regarding, yes, loan requests now, definitely when we have a loan request from an institution, and if we believe in the project, and that also it's a piece that it's easy or not too fragile to travel, or we won't miss too much because it's like, a key piece in our collection. Yes, we have objects that travel on a regular basis. And actually we had another French painting, a Bougreau. Our Bougreau was stuck also in San Diego due to COVID. Now it's back home. But yes, depending on the project, we consider, and then we go through a regular process, and yes, it travel sometimes.
And did you have some works of art that were stuck here at Hillwood that you were not able to give back because of the pandemic?
Oh, actually, yeah, I somehow, yes, because we were, so, the exhibition you mentioned, Natural Beauties, which was an exhibition of exploring like our collection of pieces of semi-precious stones. And we had borrowed like about 20 objects from the US. So the exhibition opened and then we closed a month after because of COVID. And so COVID was so long, the situation, that we only reopened in June, but we maintained the exhibition longer. So the object stayed and the exhibition was open, but some institutions have not necessarily reopened yet. So we still have some objects, like we store them for them until they can be sent back.
Thank you, Wilfried. So as the moderator of the conversation and the master of the clock, it's already 7 p.m., but would you have 5 more minutes? Because I have thousands of questions. Would you?
Sure, absolutely.
Just a little bit? Thank you. I'm sure everybody is very grateful. There is somebody who would like, and I must admit that I didn't know that you had a costume collection. And there is somebody who is asking you to talk about this costume collection. So it's a discovery for me.
I mean, this is a great question, because I did a bad job. I should have mentioned that. So one aspect of the collection, which is very important, is that, usually, which makes us also very special, is that, art collectors such as Marjorie Post will give, to become a museum, like the art collection only. But she decided to give, almost everything, like including her wardrobe and her accessories and all of this. So we have about 300 pieces of, fashion in our collection that belong to her or her family members. And technically it says the history of fashion in the US from the late 19th century to the mid 20th century. So it's pretty impressive. And we have a curator, for the 18th century collection. We have a curator for the fashion and jewelry collection. And so since, dresses and costumes cannot be displayed, on permanent basis for conservation reasons, we do some rotations in the house. So there is always things going on, not only with our exhibition program, but also through the rotations we arrange 2 or 3 times a year in the house. And so where you can see actually some of these dresses, depending on different themes or pieces of jewelry on view in the house. So yeah.
Thank you. And if I may, there are a last question, but there are many, many questions. You've been very successful, and people seem to be very happy to spend 1 hour with you tonight. There is a question about the garden. So as I remember it, it looks like a French garden. There are a lot of little buildings and fabrics. And we have a question about the dacha house. So if you could give us some hint.
Yes, so the garden is, as I said, half formal, half, woodland. And among the formal aspect, we have the French Quarter, but the rest is, we have like parts in different styles, including a Japanese style garden. The dacha. So the dacha was, of course, inspired by these Russian traditional wood houses, and she had it built in the 1960s And she had one actually in her different homes. There is one still in her, there was one in the previous home she had in Washington, D.C. at Tregaron. There is one in her camp in Top Ridge in the upstate New York in the Adirondacks. And the dacha at Hillwood was built in the late 60s during the lifetime of Marjorie Post to host actually a permanent collection that was presented to her by her very close friend, Mrs. Augusto Rosso. Mrs. Rosso was actually the wife of the Italian ambassador in Moscow in the 1930s. And actually they were very close friends, Marjorie Post and her. And so they were also collecting Russian art at the same time Marjorie Post was doing in Russia. And so she decided to give the family collection to the museum. Now the collection is actually mixed with other objects from our collection within the mansion. And the dacha is now used for special exhibitions. So it's sometimes open, sometimes it's not. We have two buildings in the estate which are actually used for special exhibition. Usually the dacha for our shows from February to June. And then the other building was built later in the 80s, so after Marjorie Post's death. And this is where we have our summer exhibition. And that's where we will open soon our exhibition Roaring 20s, which will explore actually the life of Marjorie Post at that period, and where you will see actually about 20 of our dresses.
Oh, thank you. So now it's time we went well, but do you allow me a last question?
Sure.
So there is well, I might have a beginning of answer. It's about contemporary art at Hillwood House, and I remember that a few years ago I went in the garden and there were huge faces, sculpture for like Archimbolio faces. Well, so I suppose it was contemporary.
Yes.
So you might have some activity with contemporary art. So if you could develop and give some details.
Absolutely. As part of our exhibition program, we try on a regular basis to include actually contemporary art and design into our programming when it's relevant and works with our collection. And for example, for some of our exhibition, when we focus on a specific aspect, such as porcelain, or I said hearthstone earlier on, we always try to include contemporary pieces as well to show how actually these materials are still relevant today, are still explored, source of inspiration for contemporary artists and designer. And we have built actually a whole series of exhibition of contemporary artists and designer. And next week, we are actually opening an exhibition of porcelain flowers, which are actually real sculptures made by artist Vladimir Kanevsky, who is based in New Jersey. And he's actually, this morning I was installing some of them. And this summer, we will have a wonderful exhibition in the gardens, 29 wires, life-size sculptures inspired by dance by Christine Mays, and the exhibition is called Rich Soil, and it's outdoors, so wherever we will be regarding the pandemic, so will be perfect, to visit.
Thank you, Wilfried. So I think that now it's really, really time to finish. Thank you for the 10 minutes you gave us as a gift. We are all very happy. And it is the best when you have the curator-in-chief to bring you into the garden and the museum. It was a very lavish way to receive us. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I hope we'll see all the participants and the audience for the next series organized by the Maison Française and called le Service de la Culture de l'Ambassade de France.
Hi.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Can you see me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Yeah, just a few words. Sorry. I know the time is short. Thank you a lot, Wilfried and Vanessa, for this wonderful discussion. We learned so much, and thank you, Wilfried, for sharing all your knowledge and passion for the universe of Marjorie Post and for the universe of this wonderful museum. And thanks a lot, Vanessa, for sharing and moderating the event. I am sure all the audience will be willing to visit or revisit the museums and see all these works of art with all the explanations you have been given during this hour. So thank you. And the next museum series will take place on April 21st. It will be dedicated to the exhibition in the Moonless Black Night, Syrian Art After the Uprising, that is currently at the Middle East Institute. And it brings together the work of Syrian artists to reflect on the last 10 years. So Vanessa will be in discussion with several artists whose works are exhibited currently and who also are currently residing, living in France in exile. So beyond the museum series, the Maison Française offers other online events, especially films and talks. So you can go to the website of the French Embassy. There are some pages for Maison Française, and we really hope to see you very soon. Stay safe and healthy. Have a good evening.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much.